The storm came before the armies did. On the morning of November 19th, 1274, the western coast of Kyushu Island sat wrapped in a gray wool of low cloud and salt-heavy air. The fishing villages along Hakata Bay had been silent for days. Nets unrolled on the sand, boats dragged inland, children kept close. The old fishermen had read the sea the way their fathers read scripture, and what they read now was not weather. It was something older, something that arrived on the water before the ships did. A pressure against the ears, a stillness too complete to be natural, the held breath of a world on the edge of catastrophe. Then the horizon broke open. What appeared first looked, from the shore, like a dark seam stitching the gray water to the gray sky. Then it resolved into masts, then sails, then hulls, hundreds of hulls, rising from the sea in a vast, dark procession, like the spine of some oceanic monster surfacing from the deep after centuries of sleep. The fleet stretched for miles in both directions, an armada of 900 ships carrying 40,000 soldiers, their banners snapping in the wind off the East China Sea. From the bluffs above Hakata Bay, the handful of Japanese scouts who watched them come could not count them. They stopped trying. They ran. On one side of that bay stood the largest invasion force ever assembled in the history of the Pacific world, the army of Kublai Khan, the great Khan of the Mongol Empire, master of China, Korea, Persia, and half the known world. His soldiers had ridden through the steppes of Central Asia and the streets of Baghdad. They had burned Kiev and reduced the armies of Poland and Hungary to memory. They carried weapons that Japanese warriors had never seen, exploding iron bombs that screamed through the air and burst into flame on impact, poisoned arrows, siege crossbows designed to kill at distances that made personal courage irrelevant. They were, by every measurable standard, the most advanced military force on Earth. On the other side stood Japan. Specifically, on the other side stood the samurai clans of Kyushu. Several thousand warriors at most, commanded by a handful of lords, backed by a government in Kamakura that had responded to months of Mongol ultimatums with a single magnificent act of diplomatic suicide. They had executed the Khan's ambassadors, not turned them away, executed them. And now they faced the consequences. This is the story of how an outnumbered, outgunned, outmaneuvered force of Japanese warriors held a bay against the greatest army in the world, and how, in a single catastrophic afternoon, the invincible became the drowned. This battle did not just save Japan, it invented Japan. The Japan that would exist for the next 700 years. The Japan of divine protection, of indomitable spirit, of the warrior's willingness to die facing the sea. What happened at Hakata Bay in November of 1274 planted a seed in the Japanese national consciousness that would grow into something extraordinary, something terrifying, and something that still echoes across the Pacific to this day. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. We need to go back further. we need to understand the Khan. To understand the invasion of Japan, you have to understand what the Mongol Empire was in 1274, and what it meant to be the target of its attention. Kublai Khan had inherited the largest contiguous land empire in human history. His grandfather, Genghis, had built it on a philosophy of expansion so pure it bordered on theology. The eternal blue sky had mandated Mongol supremacy over all peoples of the earth, and any ruler who refused submission was not merely a political obstacle, but a cosmic offender, an enemy of divine order itself. Genghis had imposed this worldview on China, Central Asia, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe, with campaigns of such systematic brutality that entire civilizations simply ceased to exist in the aftermath. The city of Merv in modern Turkmenistan had been one of the largest cities in the world in 1221. After the Mongols finished with it, it was rubble and bones. Nishapur, Baghdad, Kiev. The list of the erased reads like a eulogy for a lost world. Kublai had inherited this mandate, but he had also inherited a different problem. He had conquered China. The Song dynasty had finally fallen, and now he sat at the head of an empire that stretched from Korea in the east to Poland in the west, from the Arctic tundra to the jungles of Southeast Asia. Managing this required not just military power, but political legitimacy. And political legitimacy in the East Asian framework required that neighboring kingdoms acknowledge his supremacy, pay tribute, and present themselves at his court. Japan had refused. Japan had been refusing for years, with increasing contempt. Kublai Khan had sent emissaries to the Japanese court in 1266, then again in 1268, 1271, and 1272, each time bearing letters that were, in diplomatic language, polite ultimatums: submit or face the consequences. The letters described Kublai as a ruler of incomparable majesty, and asked that Japan send tribute missions and acknowledge his overlordship. They pointed out, gently but unmistakably, that resistance to the Mongol will had historically ended very badly for those who attempted it. The Japanese court, to their credit or their doom, depending on one's perspective, did not simply ignore these letters. They read them. They debated them. The imperial court in Kyoto, where real political power had long since evaporated in favor of ceremonial ritual, dithered and deferred and sent the matter to Kamakura, seat of the shogunate, the actual military government of Japan. And the shogunate, under the leadership of the regent Hojo Tokimune, made its decision in the most emphatic language available. They said nothing at all. For months, and then years, the Japanese government simply returned Kublai's envoys with no answer. This was not, as it might appear from the outside, passive behavior. In the protocol of East Asian diplomacy, silence from a subordinate was an act of extraordinary aggression. It meant, "We do not recognize your authority to ask." It meant, "Your messengers are not worth answering." It communicated to anyone who understood the language of power politics in the 13th century that Japan considered itself beyond the reach of Mongol judgment. But the final provocation came in 1274, when Kublai sent another diplomatic mission, this one personally ordered by the Khan and carrying the weight of imperial command. The Japanese government under Tokimune had them beheaded. All of them. Their heads were mounted at the gates of Kamakura. Kublai Khan received this news in his palace at Khanbalik, modern Beijing, and made his decision. Diplomacy was finished. What came next would be iron and fire. Now let us meet the men who would carry this decision into the sea. The Mongol invasion force that assembled in Korea in the autumn of 1274 was commanded by two generals, one Mongol and one Korean, though real operational authority rested with a man named Hindu, a veteran Mongol commander who had spent his career in the hard school of Mongol warfare. Hindu was not a man who improvised. He operated on the Mongol system, a system refined over 50 years of continental conquest, which meant overwhelming force, psychological terror, and the complete destruction of any defensive infrastructure before the enemy could organize meaningful resistance. He had done this in China. He had done this in Korea. He expected, with the confidence of a man who has never been wrong, that he would do it in Japan. What he did not expect was Shoni Tsunesuke. Shoni Tsunesuke was one of the senior commanders of the Kyushu defensive forces, a member of the Shoni clan that had governed northern Kyushu for generations. He was not, by any account that has survived, a military genius. He was something in some ways more useful. He was a man who knew the ground. He had grown up on that coastline. He knew where the beaches offered firm footing and where they became soft traps. He knew where the bluffs channeled attackers into killing grounds. He knew, with the intimate knowledge of a man whose family had defended this land for generations, exactly how the terrain of Hakata Bay could be made to work against an invader. He also knew his forces were catastrophically outnumbered. The full Japanese defensive force mustered for Kyushu numbered no more than 10,000 warriors, a figure that some modern scholars consider an optimistic estimate. Against 40,000 battle-hardened Mongol veterans, supported by Korean auxiliary troops, Chinese engineers, and naval artillery that could project force from the sea, the Japanese position was, by any military calculation, untenable. The Japanese warriors knew this. The commanders knew this. And yet there was no question of retreat, no discussion of negotiation, no voice raised in the councils of the Kyushu lords suggesting that perhaps submission might be preferable to annihilation. This tells us something about the nature of the samurai world in the late 13th century. We tend, from the distance of centuries, to view the samurai in abstracted, almost mythological terms, as a warrior caste defined by Bushido, by honor and loyalty and acceptance of death. But the samurai of 1274 did not yet have that fully codified philosophical framework. What they had was something rawer, more visceral, and in its way more compelling. A warrior culture that had been fighting internal civil wars for the better part of 2 centuries, that had shaped itself around the idea that battle was the only arena in which a man's worth could be measured, and that death in combat was categorically preferable to any death that did not involve meeting the enemy's face. They were, in the most literal sense, a society optimized for war. And the war had finally come to their shores. One more figure deserves mention before we reach the beaches, a figure so peripheral to the actual fighting that his name appears almost as an afterthought in most histories, yet whose presence on that coastline carries a strange weight of meaning. Among the defenders of Hakata Bay was a young warrior, barely 18 years of age, from a minor family in the Shimazu clan. His name has not survived. He appears only as a statistical unit in a few surviving records, one of the thousands of samurai who took up positions on the beach that November morning, who faced what was coming across the water, and who made his decision. We do not know if he survived. We do not know if he prayed. But he stood there, on that beach, in the cold November air, while the horizon filled with sails. And that act, standing, waiting, choosing not to run, is the whole of what we need to know about the spirit that Japan brought to that fight. The ships kept coming. The terrain of Hakata Bay is not, at first glance, a natural defensive position. The bay itself opens broadly to the northwest, a wide, shallow crescent of water roughly 15 kilometers across at its mouth, sheltered on its southern side by the city of Hakata, modern Fukuoka, and on its northern side by the Shikanoshima Peninsula, a long finger of land that partially closes the bay. The beaches are flat and wide, offering good landing ground in calm weather. The inland country rises gradually toward wooded hills. There are no natural choke points, no river mouths that could anchor a defensive line, no obvious high ground from which a small force might hold off a large one. The terrain, in short, does not favor the defender, which meant the Japanese commanders would have to create the advantage. In the weeks before the invasion, Shoni Tsunesuke and his fellow lords had done what they could with the time available. The beaches at the most likely landing points had been studied and mapped, their conditions at different tides carefully noted. Scouts had been positioned at elevated points along the coast, using the relay system of signal fires that had communicated military intelligence across Kyushu for generations. The limited number of Japanese cavalry, the mounted samurai who represented the elite striking force of any Japanese army, had been positioned well back from the waterline, where the firm ground would allow them to maneuver. The foot soldiers and archers had been placed on the beach itself, forward, where they would absorb the initial shock of landing. This was a decision born of necessity, but also of philosophy. In the Japanese military tradition of 1274, the first engagement of any battle was by convention a moment of individual challenge. The most prominent warriors on each side would announce themselves, state their lineage, challenge specific opponents, and engage in single combat while the armies watched. This was not mere ceremony. It was the formal acknowledgement that war was, at its core, a matter between men of equivalent status, governed by rules that separated civilized conflict from mere slaughter. The samurai had been fighting this way for 200 years. They had no reason to think the Mongols would be any different. They were wrong. But we are not there yet. The Mongol preparation, meanwhile, was a masterwork of logistical precision. The invasion fleet had assembled in the Korean port of Masan over the course of several months, drawing on resources from across Kublai's eastern domains. The 900 ships, Korean-built largely, pressed into service under the authority of the conquest, carried not just soldiers, but horses, provisions, engineering equipment, and a weapons system that had no equivalent in the Japanese experience. The Chinese engineers traveling with the army had brought with them a technology developed during decades of siege warfare in southern China. The explosive projectile, a cast-iron bomb filled with gunpowder and fitted with a short fuse, designed to be launched from a trebuchet or a catapult, and to burst on impact in a shower of fire and iron fragments. The Japanese had no word for this weapon. They had no concept for it. The first time they encountered it, several accounts suggest, they believed the sky itself had cracked open. The Mongol soldiers themselves were drawn from across the empire's subject peoples. The core combat troops were Mongol cavalry, the heirs to the steppe tradition that had conquered half the world. But they were supplemented by Chinese infantry units experienced in siege and assault operations, Korean auxiliary forces providing logistical support and local knowledge, and a contingent of specialized troops trained in the operation of the bomb-throwing equipment. The whole force numbered approximately 40,000 fighting men, supported by additional naval crews. It was, by any measure, not just an army, but a military system, an integrated combination of arms, tactics, and technology designed to generate overwhelming decisive force in the shortest possible time. Commander Hindu had given his troops one primary directive for the landing at Hakata Bay: speed above everything. The Mongol system worked through tempo, getting ashore faster than the defenders could organize, expanding the beachhead faster than reinforcements could arrive, breaking the enemy's decision cycle before they could mount a coherent defense. Every hour of delay was an hour for more Japanese forces to arrive from the interior. Every Japanese warrior killed in the first moments was a warrior who would not be there an hour later. Hindu intended to be off the beach and into the interior of Kyushu within the first day of fighting. The night before the landing, on the decks and in the holds of 900 ships, the army of the Khan made its own preparations. The Mongol warriors ate their last hot meal before battle: millet porridge, dried horse meat, tea. The horses, crowded in the lower decks after days at sea, were nervous and loud. The soldiers checked their equipment with the methodical calm of men who had done this dozens of times, running fingers along bowstrings to feel for moisture damage, testing the edges of blades against thumbnail, ensuring that the leather bindings of their lamellar armor were tight and undamaged. The Chinese bomb crews ran through their loading procedures one final time, making certain the fuses were the right length, the charges the right weight. Some of the Korean soldiers aboard those ships had families watching from the shore behind them. Korea had been conquered by the Mongols 17 years earlier, the final years of the campaign marked by a brutality that had burned itself into Korean collective memory. The soldiers in the Korean auxiliary units had not volunteered for this expedition. They had been conscripted, their king presented with a demand that he provide troops and ships or face a resumption of the Mongol devastation of his country. They went to Hakata Bay as men go to places they have not chosen, with the particular careful blankness of those who have learned to make their thoughts very quiet. On the beaches of Hakata Bay, the Japanese warriors spent that same night in their own preparation. The samurai did not sleep together in a single camp. The feudal structure of their society meant that each lord's retinue clustered around its own fires, each small group maintaining the hierarchical intimacy of men who had trained together, eaten together, and expected to die together. There were prayers offered to the Buddhist temples that had become deeply integrated with the warrior culture of Japan, and to the older Shinto forces of the land and sea and sky. Small ritual acts were performed: the adjustment of a helmet cord in a specific way, the touching of an amulet, the brief, whispered invocations that soldiers in every culture, in every age, perform when the darkness before battle stretches long enough to let the fear speak. A few of the senior lords spent the night in council, reviewing for the last time what they knew of the enemy's likely movements. Scouts had been reporting through the night. The fleet was anchored off the coast, not moving, apparently waiting for full daylight. This was useful information. It meant a dawn landing, or possibly mid-morning, which meant the Japanese could position themselves on the beach in full darkness and be waiting when the first boats touched shore. It meant the defenders, not the attackers, would have the psychological advantage of knowing exactly where they stood. There was one fact, however, that no amount of counsel or preparation could address. The Japanese had swords. They had bows. They had horses and courage and the absolute willingness to die. The Mongols had all of this and more. They had the bombs. By the time the gray November dawn began to lighten the eastern sky over Kyushu, both armies were ready. The beach at Hakata lay quiet between them, a narrow strip of wet sand, perhaps 50 meters wide at low tide, across which everything that was about to happen would move. The silence before it was total. It was the silence of a world drawing breath. Phase 1. The landing. Hakoazaki. The first boats hit the beach at Hakoazaki just after dawn. They came in waves, flat-bottomed landing craft cutting through the shallow water toward shore, their gunnels crowded with Mongol and Chinese troops, the muffled sound of oars carrying across the still bay like a slow drumbeat. Behind them, the fleet's larger vessels held position in deeper water, their silhouettes enormous against the morning sky. The Japanese archers on the beach heard them before they saw them, the creak and splash of 100 boats moving together, a sound that had no equivalent in their experience, a sound that belonged to a world they had never imagined. Then the light came up. The sight that resolved itself from the gray dawn was by every account that has survived, overwhelming in its scale. The beach at Hakoazaki stretched for nearly 3 kilometers, and for the full length of that beach, boats were coming in. Not a few, not dozens, hundreds. The water between the ships and the shore was churned white with oars, and above the boats the pennants and standards of the Mongol army snapped in the morning wind, red and black and gold, colors that meant nothing to the watching Japanese warriors, which somehow made them more frightening rather than less. The unknown has always been the deepest well of human dread. The samurai commanders ordered the archers forward. This was correct. It was probably the only correct move available, and the Japanese archers, trained since childhood in the yumi, the asymmetrical longbow that was the supreme weapon of Japanese warfare, began their work immediately. Arrows swept out over the water in high arcs, dropping into the crowded boats. Men fell, but for every man who fell, there were 20 behind him, and the boats kept coming. The first Mongol troops reached the beach still 50 meters from the Japanese line. They formed up in the shallow water with a speed and precision that the watching samurai had never seen in their own warfare. Not the loose individual gathering of Japanese units, but a tight, interlocking formation, shields overlapping, ranks compressed, advancing as a single organism rather than a collection of individuals. In the Japanese way of war, a formation this tight was meaningless. It prevented individual challenge, prevented single combat, prevented the decisive personal engagement through which battle outcomes were supposed to be decided. The Mongols did not know this, or did not care. They walked up the beach in their formation, took the arrow fire without breaking, and when they were within range, they answered. The Mongol bows were shorter than the Japanese yumi, but designed for rapid fire rather than individual precision. Mongol archers could lose 6 or 7 arrows in the time a Japanese archer could lose 1. Now, where the Japanese archer aimed at a specific man, selecting a target, drawing, and releasing with the meditative precision of a craft practiced for decades, the Mongol archers fired in volleys, dozens of arrows in the air simultaneously, descending like iron rain on anyone standing in the open. The Japanese line buckled, not broke, buckled. There is a distinction, and it matters enormously for what happened next. The samurai warriors on the beach at Hakoazaki had been born into a culture that treated retreat as the single most devastating act of dishonor available to a fighting man. They stepped back under the Mongol arrow fire. They shifted and compressed. They helped their wounded and closed the gaps left by the fallen, but they did not run. The Lord's screaming orders behind the line did not need to threaten or coerce. They needed only to point, forward, always forward, and the warriors complied. But they were dying, and the boats kept coming. Phase 2, the bombs. By noon, the Mongols had established a beachhead, perhaps 200 meters deep, along most of the Hakoazaki shoreline. The Japanese had contested every meter of it. The fighting in those early hours was some of the most brutal close-quarters combat in the history of Japanese warfare. Not the stylized single-combat duels of the civil wars, but a grinding, savage mass engagement in which the Japanese numerical disadvantage was most acute. For every samurai, there were 4 or 5 Mongol soldiers, and where a samurai warrior might equal 3 ordinary opponents, the mathematics of 5 to 1 allowed no room for individual excellence to alter the outcome. And then the bombs began. The first explosion on the beach at Hakoazaki was not, by itself, lethal to many Japanese soldiers. The iron sphere, about the size of a man's head, trailing smoke from its burning fuse, arced through the morning sky from the deck of one of the larger ships offshore, and landed in the sand perhaps 30 meters behind the Japanese front line. For a fraction of a second, it sat there, smoking, and then it blew apart. The sound was unlike anything the Japanese warriors had ever heard. Every account of the battle that survived describes it in some version of the same phrase, like thunder from a clear sky. The blast was not just loud, but physically concussive. It could be felt in the chest at 50 meters, in the bones at 30. The iron fragments that burst outward from the explosion cut through armor, through flesh, through the assumption that battle was something happening in the space between two men who could look each other in the eyes. The horses went mad. This was almost certainly the decisive development of the morning phase of the battle. The mounted samurai, the heavy cavalry that represented the Japanese forces' most powerful offensive arm, were positioned behind the beach to maintain mobility and launch counterattacks against Mongol flanking movements. But the horses had never heard an explosion. The sound, the smell of the burning fuse, the concussive pressure of detonation, all of it triggered a panic response in the animals that their riders could not fully control. Horses screamed and bucked and spun. Riders wrestled to maintain control. Several of the most experienced cavalry commanders spent the crucial early moments of the bomb bombardment simply trying to stay in their saddles. But here is where the Japanese made their first and most important adaptation. The samurai commanders recognized, with a speed of tactical thinking that deserves more credit than it typically receives, that the bombs were not in themselves decisive. Lethal, yes. Terrifying, absolutely. But the damage they inflicted was more psychological than physical. The bomb crews on the ships could produce only a limited number of projectiles. The trebuchets that launched them could only fire so quickly. And every moment that the Japanese line held, every moment that the warriors on the beach refused to break and run, was a moment in which the psychological impact of the bombs diminished. The samurai command made a decision. The cavalry, still struggling with terrified horses, was pulled further back, out of bomb range. The infantry was pushed forward, closing the distance to the Mongol line so rapidly that the bomb-throwing equipment, designed for standoff range, became dangerous to both sides. And the archers, repositioned, began targeting specifically the men who loaded and aimed the trebuchets. It worked. Not completely, not decisively, but it worked enough. Phase 3. Midday, the push. By mid-afternoon, Hakoazaki was carnage. The fighting had spread from the central beach north and south along the bay, the Mongol landing parties attempting to expand their beachhead, while the Japanese defenders committed every available warrior to containing the perimeter. The numbers were brutal. The Japanese were losing men faster than they could be replaced. Individual acts of ferocious courage, samurai warriors charging alone into Mongol formations, cutting down 2 and 3 opponents before being killed, were multiplied across the battlefield. But they could not change the arithmetic. The Mongol line was advancing. Slowly, expensively, at a price that would have horrified any commander less certain of his numerical superiority, but advancing. And then something happened that no one on either side had planned. Shoni Tsunesuke, watching the battle from an elevated position on the southern end of the beach, saw the pattern in the Mongol advance that Hindu almost certainly could not see from the ships. The Mongol formation was not moving as a unified front. It was fragmenting, different units pushing further forward than others, creating salients and gaps in the line as each local commander responded to the resistance immediately in front of him, rather than maintaining the overall tactical design. The right flank of the Mongol advance was perhaps 200 meters ahead of the left. Between them, a gap had opened. Tsunesuke sent a rider. The message was simple: the cavalry, all of it, now, into the gap. The rider found the cavalry commanders, still struggling with nervous horses, still trying to calm animals traumatized by the morning's explosions, and delivered the order. What happened next is one of the few moments in the battle where the surviving accounts converge into something approaching a coherent picture. The mounted samurai, perhaps 300 strong, gathered themselves in the tree line above the beach. Their horses were not calm. They were never going to be calm again, not here, not today. But they were controlled. And there their riders, every one of them aware that this charge might be the last act of their lives, drove spurs and knees and the pure force of trained will into the animals beneath them and launched themselves down the slope toward the gap in the Mongol line. The charge of the Japanese cavalry into the Mongol center was not tactically sophisticated. It was not designed to exploit a weakness with surgical precision and roll up the enemy flanks in sequence. It was 300 men on terrified horses, going as fast as they could toward the largest number of enemies they could find, with the specific intention of making those enemies pay, in blood, for every meter of Kyushu sand they had taken. It worked. For a moment, a glorious, terrible, blood-soaked moment, it worked absolutely. The Mongols in the gap, caught between the cavalry's charge and the renewed pressure of the Japanese infantry pushing from the front, folded. Not broke. Mongol troops of this quality did not break easily. But they compressed and retreated, and the retreat pulled neighboring units with it in the cascading, communicative way of armies, where local disasters become general ones if they are not contained in the first seconds. But the bombs were still falling. Hindu, watching from his command ship, had his answer to the cavalry charge ready before Tsunesuke had ordered it. The trebuchets adjusted their range, and the explosions began falling not on the beach behind the Japanese line, but in the middle of it, among the advancing infantry, and among the cavalry reforming after their charge. Phase 4. The Storm and the Decision. The sky had been darkening since mid-afternoon. What began as the gray overcast of a normal November day on the Kyushu coast had deepened by 3 o'clock into something heavier, more purposeful. The wind had picked up from the northwest, the direction the fleet had come from, and the sailors on the Mongol ships, many of them Koreans who knew these waters, began to read what was in that wind with the same cold certainty that the Hakata fishermen had read the bay's silence 4 days earlier. A storm was coming, a real one. Hindu knew it, the Korean naval commanders knew it, and the knowledge created a pressure that had nothing to do with the Japanese warriors still fighting on the beach, a pressure of time, of weather, of the terrible vulnerability of a fleet at anchor in a shallow bay when a typhoon-season storm drives in from the open sea. The 900 ships that had carried 40,000 men to Kyushu were designed for open water passage, not for riding out storms in protected anchorage. Every hour Hindu kept his fleet on station off Hakata increased the probability of catastrophic losses to weather. This changed the calculus entirely. On the beach, the Japanese defenders did not know about the storm. They did not know that Hindu, watching his advance stall against the ferocity of the samurai resistance, was calculating not just tactical gains and losses, but the survivability of his entire fleet. They knew only that they had been fighting since dawn, that they were exhausted and depleted, that the dead lay in the sand around them in numbers they had not had the luxury of counting, and that the Mongols were still there, still coming, still as numerous as they had been in the morning. The decision came at roughly 4 in the afternoon. Hindu, reviewing the situation from his command position, reached a conclusion that his Japanese opponents would not have recognized as logical. He stopped. Not retreated, not yet, but stopped advancing, consolidated the beachhead he had taken, and ordered his engineers to begin demolishing the structures in the captured portions of Hakata town. He intended to resume the next morning. He was not stopping because the Japanese had stopped him. He was stopping because the storm was coming, and he needed to manage his fleet's position through the night. On the beaches, in the sudden, strange lull after a full day of killing, the Japanese warriors stood in the lengthening shadows and looked at each other. They were still alive. The Mongol advance had stopped. The bombs had stopped falling. The beach was theirs. Not all of it, not the northern sections the Mongols had taken, but the central ground, the killing ground, where they had stood since dawn and refused to be moved. They had survived the day. No one spoke of victory. It would have been absurd to speak of victory. The numbers in front of them were the same numbers that had been there this morning. The fleet at anchor was the same fleet. Tomorrow it would begin again, and tomorrow the Japanese would have fewer warriors, fewer arrows, fewer horses willing to charge into the face of those terrible explosions. No one standing on that beach in the November twilight believed that they had won. Phase 5. The Divine Wind. What happened that night is both the most documented and the most disputed fact in the entire history of the first Mongol invasion of Japan. The storm arrived after dark, not as a gradual intensification, but as a sudden, violent presence, the way the worst storms always arrive, with a speed that makes everything that preceded it seem like a slow dream. The wind came first, driving horizontal rain so hard it stung exposed skin like gravel. Then the swells. Enormous, building rollers formed the open sea that piled up in the shallows of Hakata Bay and broke against the anchored fleet with a force that nothing made of wood and rope and human ingenuity was designed to survive. The Korean naval commanders tried everything. They tried to move the fleet to deeper water. Some succeeded, limping northwest in the dark and the rain, but many were caught in the shallows before they could build steerageway. They tried to run anchors in all directions, using multiple moorings to hold position. The anchors dragged in the soft bottom of the bay, or their lines snapped under the load. They tried to raft the ships together, using collective mass to resist the sea. The rafted ships ground against each other in the swells, timbers cracking and opening, men crushed between hulls. The fleet broke apart through the night. Ships that had survived the crossing from Korea, that had carried armies and horses and bombs and the apparatus of empire across 500 kilometers of open sea, came apart in Hakata Bay like toys. Some were driven onto the beach, their hulls grinding open on the sand, their soldiers spilling into the surf in the dark and the chaos. Some were driven against each other and sank in the impact. Some simply capsized in the enormous swells, taking everyone aboard to the bottom of the bay. The Mongol soldiers who made it to shore in the night, some swimming, some clinging to wreckage, some carried on damaged vessels that grounded rather than sank, found themselves on a beach in the dark and the storm, with no ships behind them and no army in front of them. And the Japanese, alerted to what was happening, closing from 3 sides. Of these soldiers, the accounts say only that the fighting was brief, very brief. By the following morning, the storm had passed. What it left behind was a bay full of wreckage and bodies. The fleet that had carried 40,000 men to Hakata was, depending on which account one accepts, between 1/3 and 2/3 destroyed. Somewhere between 13,000 and 20,000 Mongol soldiers had drowned in the night, killed not by the samurai they had been fighting all day, but by the sea, by the weather, by a storm that arrived at precisely the moment when the Mongol commander's options had been reduced to almost nothing.
We live.
Hindu, aboard a surviving vessel, surveyed what remained of his army. He made the same calculation that any competent commander would have made. He turned his fleet around and went back to Korea. The invasion was over. The morning of November 20th, 1274, revealed itself slowly over Hakata Bay. The storm had left the sky scoured clean, a high, bright winter blue that showed everything without mercy. The bay was dotted with wreckage, shattered planks, overturned boats, the floating debris of an army's logistical apparatus scattered across kilometers of water. On the beaches, the bodies of Mongol soldiers lay where the surf had deposited them, some stripped of armor by the sea, some still wearing the full equipment of the Khan's army, their faces turned upward toward a sky they could no longer see. The Japanese warriors who walked the beach that morning were not, by any of the accounts that have survived, celebratory. They were numb. They had been fighting since dawn the previous day, most of them without sleep in the night before vigil, and they had sustained casualties whose full extent they were only beginning to calculate. Clan records from the Shoni, the Otomo, the Shimazu, and the other major Kyushu families show losses ranging from 30 to 50% among the mounted warriors who had been in the heaviest fighting. Among the infantry and archers who had held the beach through the worst of the bombardment, the losses were higher still. The specific numbers are impossible to verify with certainty. The surviving Japanese military records, compiled in the years after the invasion and cross-referenced against clan petition documents filed with the Kamakura government, suggest that the Kyushu defenders lost somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 men killed in the fighting on November 19th. The Mongol losses in combat were considerably lower. The tactical advantage had been with the invaders throughout the day's fighting. But the storm had extracted a revenge that no Japanese sword could have achieved. Contemporary Korean sources, compiled from the accounts of survivors who made it back to the peninsula, speak of losses of more than 13,000 men to the storm alone, though this figure may include ship's crews as well as combat troops. The commanders fared as they had fought. Shoni Tsunesuke survived. He walked his ground on the morning of November 20th, still carrying the wounds from an arrow that had passed through his left shoulder during the afternoon fighting. A wound that, we know from later records, never fully healed and that gave him pain for the remaining years of his life. He was identified that morning by his family crest, visible through the blood and grime of the previous day's work, and by the fact that he was one of the few men on the beach who was giving orders rather than waiting for them. Several other senior commanders were not so fortunate. The Otomo clan's lead warrior, who had commanded the northern section of the beach defense, had been killed in the afternoon's cavalry charge. He was identified among the dead by the distinctive gap in his upper teeth, a feature noted in clan records compiled after the battle, and by the gold-inlaid tsuba of his sword, which had survived the fighting intact, even though the man who carried it had not. The Mongol dead presented a different kind of problem. Japanese custom required the collection and proper disposition of enemy dead, as well as friendly ones. But the sheer scale of the Mongol losses, spread across the beach and floating in the bay, made this impossible in any comprehensive sense. The bodies of the invaders were burned where they lay, or gathered in mass burials above the tide line, the specific identification of individual soldiers an impossibility, given the numbers and the conditions. In the town of Hakata, the Mongols had burned what they had taken. The northern quarter of the town was reduced to ash and collapsed timber, the fires set during the previous afternoon's occupation having burned through the night while the storm raged at sea. The residents who had fled inland returned to find their homes gone, their fishing equipment destroyed, their neighborhood reduced to the kind of ruin that is also, in its way, a kind of record, a permanent inscription of what had passed over that ground on that November day. From Hakata, a rider was already on the road to Kamakura. The message he carried was precise. The Mongols had landed, had fought all day, and had withdrawn during a storm that had destroyed much of their fleet. Japan had not been conquered. The message was delivered to Hojo Tokimune, the regent who had sent the Khan's ambassadors to their deaths and had thereby made all of this inevitable. He received the news from Kyushu with a composure that later writers would characterize as Buddhist serenity, and that contemporaries possibly experienced as simple exhaustion. The invasion had failed, but everyone who understood the situation, Tokimune above all, knew that it had failed because of weather, not because of Japanese military strength. The Mongol army had fought its way ashore, had held that shore against everything the defenders threw at it, and had turned back only when the storm made continued operations impossible. Without the storm, Hakata would have fallen. Kyushu would have followed. And after Kyushu, who could say? Who could calculate where 40,000 Mongol veterans, properly supplied and reinforced, would have stopped? Tokimune knew all of this. And he also knew something else. Kublai Khan was still there. Still in his palace at Khanbalik, still holding the mandate of the eternal blue sky, still possessed of armies and fleets and the institutional memory of an empire that had been absorbing battlefield reverses for 50 years and coming back larger and stronger every time. The invasion had failed for now. Now Japan had to get ready for the next one. The 7 years between the first and second Mongol invasions of Japan were the most intensive period of military preparation in the history of the Kamakura shogunate. Hojo Tokimune, facing a threat that had now taken physical form on the beaches of his own country, moved with an urgency that his earlier silence toward the Khan's ambassadors might not have predicted. The shogunate organized the construction of a coastal defense wall, a stone rampart stretching for 20 kilometers along the coast of Hakata Bay, between 2 and 3 meters high, designed specifically to prevent the kind of rapid landing that the Mongols had achieved in 1274. This wall, built by the labor of thousands of conscripted workers over several years, was not a sophisticated piece of military engineering. It was blunt, heavy, utilitarian. But it was real, and it was there when the second invasion came in 1281, and it held. The Mongols, arriving with an even larger force, 200,000 men in 2 separate fleets, found themselves unable to establish the rapid beachhead that had been the key to their success in the first invasion. They were held at sea and on the beach for weeks, exhausted and exposed, until another storm, the storm that Japanese tradition would name the Kamikaze, the divine wind, destroyed most of the second fleet as well. The word kamikaze entered the Japanese language as the description of those storms. It carried with it an interpretation that was both military and theological. Japan had been saved not by human arms alone, but by the intervention of the divine forces that governed the islands, the gods of wind and sea and land, who had looked upon the invaders and judged them unworthy of this place. This interpretation was not entirely self-serving. The storms had been real. Their timing had been extraordinary. And in a world that interpreted natural phenomena as expressions of cosmic order, the conclusion that the gods had intervened in defense of their sacred islands was not irrational, but rather the natural human response to an inexplicable survival. The concept of divine protection would shape Japanese strategic thinking for centuries. It would resurface in the darkest moments of the Pacific War, when the name kamikaze was applied to pilots who were themselves the embodiment of the same desperate logic. That Japan, facing overwhelming force, could call upon some reserve of spirit or will or divine favor that transcended material calculation. The pilots who flew their planes into American warships in 1944 and 1945 were invoking, whether they knew it consciously or not, the memory of a November storm in 1274 and what it had meant for the survival of their civilization. This is what a battle can do across centuries. It becomes, when survival is its outcome, something more than a military event. It becomes a myth, a story that a society tells itself about who it is and why it has the right to continue. The Battle of Bun'ei, which is what the 1274 invasion came to be called in Japanese historical records, was incorporated into the national story almost immediately after it ended, and it grew in the retelling. The samurai who had fought on the beaches of Hakata Bay became the embodiment of a warrior spirit that no foreign force could extinguish. The storm became the expression of a covenant between the Japanese people and the powers that governed their world. In the immediate strategic sense, the two invasions fundamentally altered the dynamics of East Asian power. Kublai Khan never attempted a third invasion of Japan. The losses of 1281 were simply too catastrophic to absorb. But the effort to defend against the Mongol threat had also exhausted the Kamakura shogunate. The enormous expense of the wall building and the military mobilization of the 1270s and 1280s, combined with the inability to reward the Kyushu warriors adequately. They had fought for their country and received nothing but their lives in return, fatally weakened the political authority of the Hojo regents. Within 50 years of the Second Mongol invasion, the Kamakura shogunate had collapsed. Japan had entered a new age of civil war, and the world that had produced the samurai who stood on the beach at Hakata was gone. But the beach remained, and in the centuries that followed, it retained its charge. The memory of what had happened there on that gray November day, when 80 men might as well have been the whole of Japan, standing between the open water and everything that the idea of Japan contained. Today, the site of the Battle of Bun'ei is a public park in the city of Fukuoka. Joggers run along the path that follows the coastline. Fishermen cast lines from the same bluffs where scouts once watched the horizon fill with sails. The stones of the defensive wall built after the first invasion have been partially excavated and are visible in sections, gray and weathered, the mortar between them still holding after 750 years. On certain November mornings, when the weather turns cold early and the overcast presses low over the bay, and the water takes on that particular iron-gray color that it must have worn on the morning of November 19th, 1274, the place remembers. The wind off the sea carries no armadas now, but it carries something, the weight of what was asked of the people who stood here, and what they gave, and what the sea took in their place. 80 men against an empire. The empire went home. The 80 did not move.